Northwest MHTTC is part of a nationwide network, and we do a lot of stuff like training events such as this. And we're based out of University of Washington. We do a lot of different things. You can see us on our website. You'll learn all about it. Land acknowledgement. We obviously need to always be honoring where we sit, and we are based out of Seattle, so we honor the Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples. Mindful of language, we always want to use culturally appropriate, recovery-based, and fostering respect and dignity when we speak about things, so it's always a good reminder. And now housekeeping. So due to the large audience, you're muted. Apparently I was, even though my headset was connected. You're not on video. Chat is available, as I should have looked before. Recording and slides will be made available on our website in a few weeks, which you'll be notified of by email. You'll also receive an email about certificates. So if you're desiring a certificate of attendance, we don't have formal CEUs, but we do have those certificates available if you'd like. Asking questions. So today, Ken is actually asking that if you have a question, put it into the Q&A box, and I will notify him as it relates to whatever topic he is. I don't know what that one is. Can you still hear me? I'm starting to be paranoid about maybe
yes,
you're
we
not
can
hearing
still hear you.
Okay, good. So anyway, someone just put a question as I was saying that, but if you have a question related to the content, I will let Ken know that. And if it's something short, we might just reply with a written answer if it's something quick or something not content related. Chat, the chat is open. Everyone's using it except for me, so I will look more closely. Evaluation, your feedback is really important and crucial to our work. So if you would please do us the honor of doing a very short survey. It just takes a couple minutes after the session. It's required by SAMHSA, but more importantly, we really appreciate your feedback. The presenters get a kind of collective report that our evaluation team does. It's all anonymous, but we really like to know, how did you like the session? What would you like to see in the future? And this helps keep our free training coming. So you'll be reminded of that in the chat box and also an email tomorrow. Just a disclaimer, SAMHSA sponsors this work, but does not, of course, reflect any official position on this content. Now the important part, Ken. One of my favorite people, Ken Crable. He is a senior trainer at C4 Innovations, has been working in healthcare, behavioral health, and homelessness and housing for more than 35 years. When I first met him, worked in Seattle, had 18 years working as a behavioral health practitioner in homeless services. And for the past 2 decades have been developing curricula and facilitating in-person and online training nationally on topics including motivational interviewing, trauma-informed care, outreach and engagement, case management, critical time intervention, and supervision. So some of you may have seen him before. He's been around doing lots of great work for a long time. So I will now turn it over to our presenter.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was a lovely example of recovery that you exhibited there. So recovery is possible. We know that. So, all right. Well, yeah, here we are. I'm gonna guess that you didn't wake up this morning saying, "Oh boy, let's go talk about trauma and its impact." It's just not one of those kinds of topics. But that said, I think it's an incredibly important topic to look at, and it's not new to any of us, of course. But we'll take a closer look today. So thank you for being here. I really appreciate your willingness to dive into this. I will say also that as we are talking about trauma, that this can be a really hard topic to even listen to somebody talk about, and there might be images perhaps that you see that are hard. And so I would just say, please do what you need to do to take care of yourself during this time. I do have some learning objectives. I think I'll let them stand, and we'll go from here. But I want to just invite you at this time for about 45 seconds or so to find in your own mind a safe place where you feel open, willing to hear. Your mind is maybe non-cluttered, non-judgmental, but you're willing just to sort of take in what you hear and do your best to respond rather than react to it. So wherever that safe place is, for many of us in the Northwest, it's somewhere out amongst the beautiful wooded areas, but it might be anywhere. So I'll just return here in 30, 40 seconds. And I'll just add a few comments. Trauma is really absorbed by the body at a cellular level. And talking about trauma can be traumatic, certainly witnessing trauma. And of course, many of us in this room today have had our own personal experiences of significant trauma, sometimes starting in early childhood. So I want to acknowledge that, the reality of it, and also just invite you to pay attention to your body in particular as we're going through this, and do what you need to do to feel safe and comfortable enough, at least. So I'm going to start with telling you a quick story. And I I live in Seattle. I worked at Downtown Emergency Service Center, and for 15 years of my 18 years there, I was part of the Healthcare for the Homeless program employed by Harborview. And I worked on a mental health team alongside a psychiatrist and other mental health practitioners and a chemical dependency counselor, as we called them then. And my role was in many ways to help document disability for people so that they could be accepted on SSI, SSDI. And so part of my role was to actually do assessments, write up, people's histories, and then also create a provisional diagnosis of what was happening. And I think we were doing the DSM-3 revised at that point in time. But I remember taking pride in this ability to sort of figure out what was happening with people and categorize them and put them into these boxes, if you will, these diagnostic boxes. And as you can imagine, that was kind of a futile effort, although I did the best I could. But somewhere in the 80s, a book came to my attention called Trauma and Recovery by Judith Lewis Herman. I'm guessing a number of you have read it. A seminal book at the time that really began to open my eyes and my team to the fact that all of these diagnoses that we make in the mental health world, not all of them, but many of them, are based on a constellation of symptoms. And what I was seeing in the people that I was encountering and trying to assist was they were demonstrating symptoms that were all over the map. They didn't fit nicely into the neat categories. And so there was some depression, there was anxiety, there was some psychosis, and often delusional material, but there was also, kind of these other kinds of axis 2 feeling, like we called them axis 2 at the time, kind of personality disorder types. And so anyway, as you know, it was harder and harder and harder for me to, in good faith and ethically, to try to diagnose somebody. And then this idea came along that I was introduced to of traumatic stress and the impact of trauma and how it results in all of these different ways that people respond, react. And so the whole idea of PTSD, of looking at people through a trauma lens and a trauma-informed lens, really became critically important. And I feel like over the years, I've learned so much more than I knew then. And now I feel like I have so much more to learn, but we're on a learning journey. So I'm here to share with you some of my understandings on this journey where I am, and I invite you to come along in that. I'm going to offer you here some metaphors. You won't find these in the literature, but they're metaphors that get are expressive, I think, of the nature of trauma as we enter into the shadows, into the hard conversations around this. And before we do that, I'm going to ask you in the chat box to go ahead and name in a word or a phrase how you think a person might respond to this phrase. The world is. In a word or a phrase, how might people who have experienced long-term trauma, early childhood trauma, trauma that shaped them, what are the likely kinds of responses you might find here? And I realize that I'm simply not going to be able to reiterate all of these, but I'm seeing exactly what I would expect to see, and that comes up all the time. This unsafe and dangerous and untrustworthy, crazy, unpredictable, challenging, confusing, absolutely, and more. Here's another that I'll invite you to respond to. How about this one? They always think that they always think that I am broken. Yeah, yeah. I overreact to everything. I'm always sad. I'm the problem. I'm overly dramatic. Yep, yep. I'm really not trying my best. And I'm trying to fuck up. Exactly. Yeah. Or I am a fuck up. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for all these. I'm sorry, I can barely keep track, but you get the idea. How about this? I will never be. I will never be. Oftentimes we hear things like whole, normal, enough, good enough, worthy, loved. I'll never be able to rest in another person's arms comfortably, and so on and so forth. And another is I am. I am, and this is connected, of course, to some of these, but I'm a burden. Yeah, yeah. And I'm broken. I'm a survivor. Yep. And I'm beautiful. Yeah. So in the midst of recovery, we find new ways of ourselves that were always there, but are forthcoming. But isn't it true, though, that the overwhelming sort of self-narrative is one of being at fault and being a burden to others and not valued and so on and so forth. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you one more, and this just takes a little different twist. If they really cared, and you know who they is, if they really cared, they would see me. Yep. They would listen. They would help in meaningful ways. They would believe what I say. Yeah. Yeah. They'd protect and hear and see past the behavior or recognize the behavior as adaptive behavior. It's not doing it to try to make life harder for anybody, right? And they'd be empathic and understanding. Sometimes they'd go away. Exactly. Yeah. All right. Thank you all. I so appreciate this, and it gives us a flavor in just a few brief words and phrases about kind of the nature of one's world and worldview and how they see others and themselves. And this is the impact of trauma that we all recognize and can see how it has such an impact on lots of other aspects of life. One of the things we know about trauma is you're not supposed to talk about it, and so whether it's you talking about it yourself to somebody else or whether it's in the larger culture talking about it, it's just not something that's nice to talk about, right? And so sharing a few quotes here from people who have been really important people, I think, in the world of understanding trauma and recovery. Peter Levine says it's the most avoided, ignored, denied, understood, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. And goes on to say it's a public health crisis that we refuse to see. And trauma is, of course, something that permeates all aspects of our lives. Judith Lewis Herman said that the ordinary response to atrocities and trauma is to banish them from consciousness. Now, this is sometimes conscious, and sometimes it's not. It's unconscious. It's a way for our bodies to protect ourselves, our minds to protect ourselves, to push them away into some recess of our consciousness, our memory, or sometimes we just say, I'm not going to talk about that. So at many levels, we banish it. So it really is something that's not to be spoken of. And yet we're going to speak about it, because in speaking about it, we let go of the secretiveness nature, which is incredibly damaging about trauma. And there's something liberating even about naming it for what it is. And so that's part of what we're doing here. So I had the opportunity to receive a book of poetry back in the 1980s from a group of homeless and formerly homeless women in Seattle who had written a compendium of poems. And I'm just going to share two here with you. One of the things we know about trauma is it's hard to talk about it directly, but it's a little easier to talk about it through poetry and lyrics and songs and metaphors and things like that. So I'll just share these with you. Heidi H. says, I used to have no trespassing signs all over my body. Some people just don't know the meaning of boundaries. One day they came and busted down my door. They came in violating code. They tore up my floors and gutted my soul. They put a jackhammer through my walls and a sledgehammer to my head. I've got enough yellow police tape to hang myself. Catherine H. says, trying to get close to my mom was like getting close with a vacuum sweeper. Being close with my father has been being close with a lawnmower. Powerful metaphors. One of the things we know about trauma is that it disconnects people from their own bodies. And I love this imagery of, in love, we are swept off our feet. And in trauma, our legs are pulled out from under us. I hope that each one of us in this room has been swept off your feet, maybe even more than once or multiple times with the same person. But that's a beautiful thing. But the beauty of that is it also means that there will be a landing, that your feet will come back down and hit the floor and you'll still be on solid ground. However, in trauma, when our legs are pulled out from under us, the landing is much different and much more harsh. And so again, a metaphor that I think explains very aptly the impact of trauma. Now, it also turns out that trauma is normal, quote unquote. And it's something that it's kind of it was revealed to me, I guess, through other people's writing in a way that wasn't exactly present early on, but the more I have thought about it, the more I realize how normal trauma is. And I share this story from the country of Mauritania in Africa. I was taken from my father as a 5-year-old. Every day I looked after the herd. Every night I was raped by my master. I always thought, without understanding, that this was normal. In Mauritania, where I'm from, hundreds of thousands of people are still held this way today, but I was lucky. My brother escaped his masters and found an organization working to stop sexual slavery. He asked me to help free me. He asked them to help free me. And then notice what comes next. But when they came to take me away, at first I completely refused. I couldn't imagine a life away from my masters. It was the only life I had ever known. It was normal.
Hey, Ken.
Yeah.
Sorry to chime in, but we have actually had a number of people raise their hands, and I think that means they have a question. So I don't want to interrupt, but I wanted to see if I should ask if they wanted to, I can unmute them. And is this a good time to do that?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay. So Jasmine, I think, is first on the list. So Jasmine, I'm going to unmute you, and please feel free to ask your question. And if you raised your hand by accident and you didn't mean to do that, you can, I think, lower your hand. But otherwise, I'll go to, oh, no, she disappeared. Okay, people are, now they are not raising their hands. So I see, nope. I think me just saying that meant a lot of people took their hand. Okay, so Jennifer, has a question, so I'm going to unmute you, Jennifer. Nope, nobody wants to actually. I think maybe they were just in solidarity with maybe what you're saying. I'm not sure. A lot of resonating comments there. So Amber, if you would like to ask a question, I will allow you to talk. Okay. Amber, if you're there, you are out there.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, I'm sorry. I think that was in the beginning. It wasn't for now, so I apologize. I think I was just trying to figure out if we were all going to show up on here with faces for Zoom. So my apologies. That was from the very beginning. So
hey, well, I had never seen people raise their hands, so no problem. Thank you, Amber. I still see a few others up there.
Christina,
Carolina. Oh,
may I make a suggestion?
Sure, absolutely.
Let's ask people to type their questions in the Q&A box, and if you find some there, let me know.
Will do. That makes a lot more sense.
Otherwise, I'm just assuming if you're raising your hand, you're so polite and wondering if you need permission to go to the bathroom, but I don't think that's the case. So.
I am seeing this. This is just like a fun new day. It's because they couldn't hear me before, and that's why everybody raised their hands and they stayed there. So we'll lower all the hands, and please use the Q&A box. Thank you very much. We're learning every day. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So trauma is a thief, and I'm going to ask you in the chat box to go ahead and just name 1, 2, 3 things that come to mind that get stolen, just so we can get a broad sense of what this thievery looks like and the impact of it. So again, in the chat box, I appreciate your participation. I also appreciate those of you who choose not to write, but are willing to listen in and see what other people are writing. Yeah, it's just a huge list, isn't it? We're robbed of our physical comforts and sleep and eating, but also of our identity and our sense of self-respect and a sense of joy and having a lightness of being, if you will, and fundamentally of respect. Yeah, yeah. Safety for sure, of our youth oftentimes for many people, of faith. Yeah, it's hard to trust. And so absolutely, and again, you're nailing it. I've put here inadvertently some ideas that capture exactly what you're saying. So at any rate, I think the point is made, and we'll head on. So I want to share a few things, and I apologize, these are kind of little laundry lists, but I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. But why does any of this matter? Why does it matter to know about trauma and its impact in order to do our work? And a lot of these come from SAMHSA, and I've adapted them in some ways. But one of the things we know from the ACE study that we'll hopefully look at a bit is that trauma has a direct impact on people's overall health, mental health, and well-being. Literally, people are more likely to die earlier, are likely to contract chronic conditions and diseases, are more likely to be suicidal, and so on and so forth as a result of trauma experiences. We also know that trauma has a direct impact on how people engage with you and me, right? In how they present themselves. And we know that oftentimes that how takes the form of the common things we talk about of being in flight, of maybe not showing up or showing up intermittently, or a fight, of standing up and what we might call demanding when in fact they're just trying to get their needs met, right? Or it might be, freeze. They might just sort of not know what to say or how to say it, or say so little, and so on and so forth. And so we're going to recognize that people are engaging in ways that they do the best they can to meet their needs, but they might not be all that user-friendly for those of us as mental health practitioners. We also need to what to do when somebody discloses a past history of trauma, maybe for the first time or maybe not, but what do we do and how do we respond to that? And I'll just say parenthetically, absolutely acknowledge it and absolutely kind of normalize it, and absolutely don't go into the depths of it. We're not here talking about being trauma treaters, we're talking about being trauma informed. And so, but naming and acknowledging trauma and what has happened is so important, so that it doesn't become an ongoing secret, or the secret becomes revealed to some degree. And then we also know that health outcomes will improve when people are able to recognize the impact of trauma and begin to address those. And then also we can manage risk better. And one of the examples that often comes to my mind is that we know that for people who have histories of trauma, that oftentimes they begin to feel not alive or dead, and not feeling at all. And for many people, they engage in cutting or in self-burning activities or other things that hurt and might be self-harmful. Um, and we need to recognize that this might be somewhere on the continuum of suicidal behavior, but most likely it's not, in many cases at least, that it's actually probably more just an expression of wanting to feel alive, wanting a release, wanting to feel something. And as maybe odd as that might feel to one's logical mind, it makes perfect sense to the person engaged in it at one level at least. We also know that we can re-traumatize people, and I won't ask you to tell me how that happens, but I hope we can all recognize that it does happen. But if we don't maintain confidentiality, when we provide touch, and I know this is the age of COVID, but even when we do provide touch, huggers don't fare well with people who are traumatized unless there's a very clear acknowledgement that this is mutually consented upon. Personal distressing questions that we ask oftentimes prematurely, being an expert rather than a partner in your approach to people. And of course you have expertise, but so does that person, and we need to recognize that. Or this idea of there's only one right way to recovery, or only one right way to whatever that is. This is a sign and symptom of white dominant thinking, and there are multiple pathways, as we all know, to moving forward and getting better and recovering. We also know that our own trauma that is not resolved will get transmitted oftentimes in our relationships with people. And so we ourselves may be responding in ways that we don't even recognize as being re-traumatizing, because we haven't yet at least gone fairly far in the journey of finding and recognizing that trauma and its impact on us, and then how that gets expressed. And so unresolved trauma, trauma that's not resolved is often transmitted. We could talk a lot about institutional inequities that are traumatizing, particularly for people of color, or for LGBTQ folks, or for women, or for people who are marginalized in some way or another. We can also talk about staff bias and the attitudes that we bring forward, or don't bring forward because of an unwillingness to address, perhaps. Either or thinking is another one of those characteristics of white dominant thinking, where there's a binary way of seeing the world, and it's either this or that. It's either my way or the highway, right? And again, we have to begin thinking much more in multiplicities and in ways that sees nuance. All of these things can be re-traumatizing, including rigid policies and procedures that don't have any element of individualization around the ability to interpret them or apply them. I'm sure you could add more. I'm going to go ahead and move us on to just say that, and I touched on this, but when you meet with people and you feel like there's an avoidance, or there's not a willingness to open up, or feel like people are hiding something maybe, it may well be that underlying all of that is a true fear of not being seen or heard or taken seriously, or not being believed. And so why would you reveal something to somebody who you don't even know for sure if they're likely to take you seriously? We also know that this whole idea of trust is well-founded. It's not uncommon for people to grow up, or even as adults, to put their faith and trust in somebody, sometimes even professionals, only to be have that person turn around and be controlling or exploiting them for some reason, or abandon them. And again, trust is hard enough with somebody who's trustworthy, but for somebody who's not trustworthy, to put your trust in them and then have that torn away is really really hard. I remember a quote from Judith Lewis Herman in her book. She said, one of the characteristics of trauma is, for kids especially, is having to put your trust in people, parents oftentimes, who are inherently untrustworthy. And that is the dilemma of trauma. I talk about transactional relationships because many times people will come to us and we get a sense that they're trying to get something out of us, right? And understandably, but it's almost as if, we don't exist as a human being, and they just see us as almost a machine that they can put a quarter in and get a candy bar out or something. But it makes sense that people would engage in transactional relationships, in which I define that as trying to get the most from somebody else and give up the least in return. But when we meet with people and we feel like they're not really engaging with us at a more human level, well, there's some reason for that, and that will take time. And then, we think about people missing appointments, not showing up on Zoom, all of these things. There may be lots of reasons for that, but it might well be related specifically to a trauma response as well. Just taking a quick look. Bobby, I'm seeing your comment. I appreciate that. You're Native American, understand historical trauma. Yeah, we need to talk briefly about types of trauma, but historical trauma, generational trauma, insidious trauma, all of those are aspects of what you're referring to. And we're getting clearer based on research that this has an effect even at a genetic level, around epigenetics, that this is the case. All right, so yes, recommended reading for sure, The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk. There are many good books, but I think that one is one of the more recent and a wonderful, easy to read in many ways, but full of research and stories, and quite impressive. So I recommend it highly. All right, so this is something that would be more in a trauma-informed approach training, but one of the things I'll just say, if we understand trauma and its impact, we will then have the gateway to become more trauma-informed, so people get better services and care, and that we can cope more effectively with the work that we're doing and be more resilient, and that we hang on in the job and don't turn over, and are able to even find a sense of satisfaction and joy in doing the work. And that the vicarious trauma that we almost always will experience at some level, it's hard to avoid, will at least be decreased or lessened. So these are other good reasons. So I share this image with you. You may or may not recognize it. It is something called kintsukuroi. And what this is a Japanese art of mending pottery that is obviously broken, using a gold or a silver or some kind of a beautiful lacquer to mend it back together. And I think this really becomes a really interesting metaphor. It's not perfect, but it's a metaphor for how trauma can break us apart in so many ways, and disconnect us and cause us to feel like the pieces of our minds and bodies don't fit together. And somehow these can be transformed piece by piece, bit by bit. We can in fact experience a sense of recovery. And I think this is something to always keep in mind whenever we get into the weeds of trauma and its impact, to remember that recovery from trauma is absolutely possible. And some of us are living examples of that on this call. I'm going to show you a video. This is Chad, and it's about, I want to say, 5 or 6 minutes. And what I'm going to ask you to do as you watch it is several things. One is, where do you see in this experience of Chad where there are pieces that are unspeakable, or there's kind of a almost normalness to it, or a thievery? What has been stolen from Chad? And then the second is, in terms of the encounters he has with other people in the community, what was helpful in that, or potentially less than helpful? And so we'll take a look at that. So here we go.
Because here everybody knew our business, knew what was happening.
Can you hear now? Let me try this again. Sorry about that. I'm going to do something and I'll be right back. I'm going to stop share and I'll see you in a moment. All right, sorry about the delay, but let's see if this works better now.
It's just hard with that. I was just a kid. Because here everybody knew our business, knew what was happening to us, and it was brutal. Oh my God, there's a school. If you go right up here, there's a turn, and you can situate it. Tough thing back here. Yeah. This is crazy. There were some good times though, we'd have a good 30 minutes or so before we heard the sliding glass door open. And one day he came in and he actually had pizza, like supreme pizza. And another day, he was fine. And another day he came in, for no reason, he just smashed my mom's head against that cabinet there. Just thinking of, just to the left of where they're playing, it's where my brother and I would play. My dad, he would come home and we had to be really good at sports and stuff, so. There's one time where we were sitting, I knew it was coming. I knew my brother, Bobby, I knew that he would be the one to bear the brunt of it. And so I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Chad reminds me of a lot of the kids that come through here. Angry, very angry. And you could tell he just didn't want to connect with anybody. And you could tell he was hiding something. He always came in with a nervous stomach. My stomach hurts. And he finally came clean and told me his father had major anger issues. He said, I need to talk to somebody. And I instantly thought of Coach Morrow.
Good job.
Chad wasn't a football player per se. He was just a kid that had energy that needed to do something. He needed to be a part of something because I don't think he had anyone as a role model or someone showing him what to do. On the whistle.
Coach Morrow was the only person I really trusted in this town. He was always there.
Yeah, there was times I would give him a ride home. We would talk, sometimes we wouldn't talk. But it was interesting to have a discussion with someone, a young man who had no one to talk to.
He was the only one there for my graduation. My family wasn't there.
You're doing good. You're okay.
I just remember when you were walking across, I just remember looking up. You had this big old just ear to ear grin.
It takes a village to raise a child. And it doesn't matter what nationality, what race, we're all from the human race. If you interact with someone, it shows them that you care.
Good memories, you know? You gotta hold on to those.
It's love thy neighbor. It's what we should do.
When's the last time you saw him? About 8 years ago. And actually, right over here is Lucille's barbecue. The best barbecue you'll ever have in your life. And Coach Morrow actually took me there, like after high school graduation. But take this right. This is gonna be your first right over there. Just pull in, not this one, but. I freaking knew it. I freaking knew it. I did too. I knew something was up. I knew something with that. I knew it. I knew you all doing something.
Oh, you did. There he is. I heard you were in town. I knew you couldn't pass up some Lucille's, man. Oh, good to see you. I'm so proud of you. Done well. Done well.
So I invite you in the chat box if you want to respond to any of these questions. Maybe the first one first. Unspeakable, normal. Anything come up for you? It's interesting to me that the family, at the very beginning, it says everybody in town knew about this, but it was apparently unspeakable. But certainly stolen childhood, impact, education, too hard to talk about. Yeah. Stole his opportunity to have good memories of safety. Yeah. Let me turn to the question of who was helpful. I think we all know Coach Morrow wasn't particularly helpful. What was it he did? Because he wasn't exactly a professional mental health person, but he did a lot of really important mental health supportive kinds of things, right? And I am seeing some of the cultural aspects here. Thank you for that. This is a whole nother angle on this, yeah. But he let Chad talk and supported him. He took an interest. He gave him something to do, to use his body. He wasn't a football player per se, but he could get things out with his body there. But he would take him home. He went to his graduation. He just entered into his life, saw him, and believed him and recognized him without trying to fix him, I think is an important part, and gave him a sense of community. Now, I do want to pinpoint something here, and this is a problem I have with this video. And maybe you noticed it, maybe you didn't, but the school counselor describes Chad and kind of midway through, and she says several things. And she says, one is, he was angry. Chad was angry, very angry. I wonder how you might think that Chad would describe how he was feeling. He might say, I'm angry, but what are some other possibilities for what he might say? Yeah, Tanya, I'm hurting. I'm afraid, scared, isolated, lost. Absolutely. Frustrated. Yeah. All of those. How about this one? She also says, you could tell he didn't want to connect with anyone. What do you think, from Chad's point of view, he was deeply hoping for and desiring and longing for? Connection. Absolutely. Yeah. He wanted some love. He wanted some attention. He wanted to have some power. He wanted to feel something from somebody who says, I accept you. Absolutely. She also says, you could tell he was hiding something. What do you think about that one? How do you think Chad's going to say, hey, I'm hiding something? No, but what's going to be going through Chad's mind? Shame. Yeah. I just, yes, it all does make him the problem. And it's fear. It's not feeling safe enough to talk about something. And of course, he's going to keep that inside because you can't trust. The last thing she said was, he finally came clean and then told me his father had major anger issues. I'm going to take issue with he finally came clean and ask you again to reframe that into more person-centered language. He finally came clean. He finally was able to speak freely in a way of opening up, exactly, because it did feel safe. And he had the courage, therefore, and the confidence to say something without feeling like he was going to be, further judged or put down. Yeah, thank you all. Thank you. So again, I've provided some handouts which have links for this video. There's another one that's kind of a companion video that I highly recommend as well, and others. But for now, we'll move on. I did see that there are some questions. So let me open up the Q&A and see if there might be something there that I might respond to. I realize these came earlier, but with the staff biases, is there a slide about intersectionalities? I don't have one, and I appreciate your bringing that up, because I think this whole area of bias and kind of just lack of equity language and perspectives plays throughout all of this, and trauma is totally related to racial equity and all of the other inequities that we talk about, and the intersectionality is so much a part. But I thank you for that. I'm going to take it as a suggestion to add. Lisa says, my mom's a trauma survivor, but has been given the diagnosis of bipolar or borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder. I've often wondered if it is trauma effects versus, Lisa, my understanding around the borderline personality is that maybe 95% or so of folks, you can trace back a childhood history of significant trauma that has shaped how people have come to see each other, see the world, and increasingly, I can't separate in my own mind borderline personality disorder as a diagnosis from trauma. That said, bipolar disorder often comes up because people are kind of back and forth all over the map, elated, and one day, everything's great and you're raring to go and you're productive, and the next you're down in the dumps. Other diagnoses often get added to this too. The one I think that often, and I'm not here to say for sure, but I think complex PTSD is the term that I think is most akin to what we're seeing and oftentimes in people. And it's still not something that the DSM people have totally embraced, but they're toying with it. But this idea of complex trauma, and you have some handouts on it, I think really begin to speak about the characteristics and ways that people present. And I think these diagnoses are helpful for reimbursement reasons, but I think, and maybe for other reasons clinically too, but I think they fall short of really having a fuller picture of what's happening with people. They're not asking the question of what happened to this person. And then the question, Sharon, you ask about agency, and people absolutely experience trauma and respond in totally different ways. And it's unpredictable. What we know is that some people have personality styles and traits, they have protective factors, they have connections with people that make them more likely to be able to not be, really broken apart by all of this. But that said, some do. And I don't know if CPS was ever called or not. I would hope it was, but I don't know. And how far behind is our practice from what we know about the impact of trauma? Is there anyone, any place that is implementing? There are, yeah, there are. And I'm not in a position to name them, but I'm guessing that many of you work for some of those organizations. And I think we've come a long way. That the whole idea of being trauma-informed didn't even really come into our lexicon until the early 2000s. And so now it's kind of become a thing, and everybody wants to be trauma-informed, and they say we're trauma-informed because funders want to chase after best practices. But you have to lift the lid and look underneath. It's kind of like lots of people say, yeah, we do housing first. We do motivational interviewing, but it's almost like you want to ask, show me a tape, or show me, let me walk through your program, or let me talk to the people receiving services, that kind of thing. But I think that, we're making progress around that. And I will say that trauma-informed is, there's some new language around that I think is really helpful too. Sean Ginwright talks about trauma-informed care as healing-centered engagement, to move it beyond just being informed, but to actually put it into practice. And I think increasingly we're finding recovery-oriented approaches, healing-centered, strengths-based approaches is really being added to and enriching the idea of being trauma-informed. So I'm going to go back to slides, but I appreciate all of this, and we'll come back as I can. So I'm going to go briefly through this, but I just want to say we all experience stress, and there's eustress, EU stress. That's good stress, and it's the kind of stress that happens when we wake up in the morning and have to figure out what to wear and whether or not to shower and that kind of thing. But it's basically good stress, but it's still stress. But then there's negative stress, and this comes along, with maybe masking and when we go outside, and worrying or overworking, wearing too many hats, primarily negative stress. But when it becomes traumatic or toxic stress, then we're talking about awful things that happen to people, assault and neglect and abandonment and witnessing things. And here we include racism and sexism and homophobia and the generational trauma, and all of those things are all parts of this traumatic stress. And they result oftentimes in a post-traumatic stress response, meaning that all of this wear and tear that happens in traumatic stress has a toll. And then it becomes something where, as many of you know, with PTSD, your symptoms live on as if the past was in the current present. And of course, we talk about flashbacks and hallucinations, and we talk about living at volatile emotional reactions, and so on and so forth. Again, we know that the primary response to stress of any kind starts with the body, and it's something that when we know that when our bodies respond as it needs to in a protective way by releasing cortisol and adrenaline and other stress hormones, that's great. But it's not great if that release of those chemicals continually or nearly continually is at work, because what happens is, and you know the revved up feel of being under the influence of cortisol, right? And what happens is this begins drawing attention away from the health needs of other organs and other things, and wears people down. And again, much of this is spoken to in the book that many of you have already mentioned, The Body Keeps the Score, and I do want to recommend that. So we're talking here about overwhelming demands. That's what traumatic stress is about. We're also talking about you know, a threat to one's physical or emotional well-being that's overwhelming, results in intense feelings of fear and lack of control, leaving people helpless, and changes literally the way people understand the world. Now, for some people, this is relatively short-lived. For others, it becomes it dominates their lives and everywhere in between. But being traumatized, as Bessel van der Kolk talks, is continuing to organize your life as if that trauma were still going on. I think this is the piece that we need to fully understand, that it's as if, even though we see the person's circumstances, maybe they're now in good housing, have relationships, but those encounters from the past still come back as if they're real right now. And long after the actual event is gone, the brain continues to send signals to the body to escape that threat that doesn't exist. Now, we do know in trauma-informed practice, there are ways to decrease this sort of reactivity and bring calmness to our bodies through breath and through massage and through yoga and through therapies that exist. So it's not as if it has to continue ongoing. Fundamentally, and for me, this is really a kind of a foundational idea, that trauma almost invariably involves not being seen, not being mirrored, and not being taken into account. And I certainly, in my own work with people experiencing homelessness, I've heard people so many times experience not being seen when they were out on the streets, right? Not really being seen. Not really being mirrored, meaning that not having that synchronicity that happens in relationships that starts early on in childhood, that is the building blocks of communication and good feelings, and not being taken into account, not being taken seriously, not being asked what they want and hope for. And I think if we can see, mirror, and take people into account, fundamentally, we go such a long way towards being able to alleviate some of the suffering that people experience. So many of you have seen this, I bet. And even if the sound doesn't work, which I think it will, but I'm going to ask you just to watch this again, perhaps for you, and just notice the ways that this young boy is being seen, being regarded, being heard, being mirrored, and then we'll go from there.
Oh yeah. Right. Don't bring that in. You know what I'm saying? Don't do the same stuff. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I was like that. Yeah. Yeah. Like go somewhere else with that, but don't bring it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's what I said. They was like, you know what I'm saying? And I was like, what in the world? Don't do that here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Really? I thought the same thing. We think a lot alike, huh? Oh, that's crazy. Right.
Love that video, and I think many of you express the same thing. But I think it's this wonderful illustration of what caring looks like, and whether it's a father, a mom, or a caregiver, or a professional counselor, we can all develop ways to see, mimic, or mirror, which is mimicry, and be able to believe people and take them into account. And that goes such a long way towards fostering healing, of course. So I'm going to just say there are many sources of trauma. We name some of them here. Again, we could go deeply into this, and for the sake of today, I'm just going to name them if I may, and we'll go on to talking about acute trauma and chronic trauma and complex trauma that I talked about. And again, I'm just naming these, but please recognize that even a one-time event, acute trauma, can be devastating for people. That said, when that is compounded by multiple traumatic experiences, it's even more likely the person is going to develop traumatic stress reactions. And then complex developmental trauma, developmental referring to the early childhood part, often starts in early childhood, but it's the kind of trauma that's, I think, the most likely to have lasting effect and bring people in for our mental health services oftentimes. It affects all aspects of their lives. So I do encourage you to read more about complex developmental trauma. I'm going to read you just a brief passage from Bessel van der Kolk's book, which is hard to hear, but I think it's important to capture what I'm talking about around complex trauma. Anthony was only 2.5 when he was referred to our trauma center by a childcare center because its employees could not manage his constant biting and pushing, his refusal to take naps, and his intractable crying, head banging, and rocking. He did not feel safe with any staff member and fluctuated between despondent collapse and angry defiance. When we met with him and his mother, he anxiously clung to her, hiding his face, while she kept saying, "Don't be such a big baby." He startled when a door banged somewhere down the corridor and then burrowed deeply into his mom's lap. When she pushed him away, he sat in a corner and started to bang his head. "He just does that to bug me," his mother remarked. So I'm going to pause there for a moment. And before we go all judgy on mom, I want to read the next part. When we asked about her own background, she told us that she'd been abandoned by her parents and raised by a series of relatives who hit her, ignored her, and started to sexually abuse her at age 13. She had become pregnant by a drunken boyfriend who left her when she told him that she was carrying his child. Anthony was just like his father, she said, a good for nothing. She had had numerous violent rows with subsequent boyfriends, but she was sure that this had happened too late at night for Anthony to notice. If Anthony were admitted to a hospital, he would likely be diagnosed with a host of different psychiatric disorders: depression, oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety, reactive attachment disorder, ADHD, and PTSD. None of these diagnoses, however, would clarify what was wrong with Anthony, that he was scared to death and fighting for his life, and he did not trust that his mother could help him. Scared to death and fighting for his life. So I'm doing a time check here, and I realize that as almost is always the case, I prepare too much material because I'm never quite sure if I have anything to say. But turns out maybe I do have some things to say, and I've so appreciated your interactions here. I think many of you are familiar with the ACE study. If you're not, I strongly recommend learning about it. Briefly, it was a set of 10 questions about childhood trauma in the home. And it was asked of a very white, educated, employed cohort of people. This was in the 1990s. And the idea was to find out what the occurrence was of a variety of different things. And so these were the topical areas around which these questions were asked. And it's often something like, did you ever experience da-da-da-da, but it was also often described in a little more detail. But these were the things. Now, before we go any further, I'm just going to ask you, as you think about looking back today, 25 years later or so, what's missing? What's missing that they might have asked about, but didn't for research reasons, which is fine. But what do you think might also be some other areas that we might ask people outside of within the home. And so the isms absolutely come up, and military violence and military families and their experience, absolutely. Racial trauma. And so just a few more things that come to mind too are bias and racism, as we mentioned, and witnessing violence, bullying that happens on playgrounds and schools, deportation concerns, unsafe neighborhoods, homelessness, war zones, and on and on and on. And so I would just say that the ACE study, fortunately, was a game changer and was taken very seriously. And it's also been adapted. I know that the city of Philadelphia has used an ACE study that is a little more expansive about the questions they ask and all over. But what we learned from all of this is that ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, happen so much more common than anyone thought. And then that we're looking at least 87% of people who have at least one ACE have another. And the prevalence of these different kinds of violence, excuse me, are here. But the correlation to health outcomes was really the striking outcome. And what we know is that trauma increases the risk of our neurological, biological, psychological, and social difficulties. Brain changes, body changes, and we adopt more harmful behaviors as a result. And I'm moving too fast here, but these slides will be made available to you. But what happens is we begin to see an increase then in risky health behaviors and harmful behaviors. And then we start to see chronic conditions that start to emerge. And we see the fact that once you have 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences, and I've certainly met people with 10, some of you in this call have had that many, you see this really exponential increase in the impact it has. And when we get into the 6 or higher range, people are going to die 20 years earlier by average, and suicidal behavior is going to increase. Attempted suicide is going to increase by 30-fold. And so this is a snapshot of some of the findings of all of this. And so we know that the brain is what takes care of us in all this and mediates all of this trauma that comes forward. And I think if I don't have time, so I think I won't do it. Can somebody correct me? I think I need to stop in 3 minutes. Yes. Is that right?
Yep.
All right. Okay. What I think I'll do is just stop right there, and I'll just ask you all if there's any questions remaining or any comments or thoughts, and we'll just we'll pretend this was just part of the journey of our learning and leave it there.
Wow. Thank you, Ken, so much, as always. Just for fun, I have to say I have known Ken for over 20 years, and your training events are always this good. I'm sure they have gotten better over the years, but this is incredible information, and everyone has responded so much, and there's so much discussion, and I know it's so hard to do this all virtually, but I think you fostered, I can just say from we're doing a lot of these things, that you fostered such a nice mini community during our time together, and so much sharing and so much connection. And I really appreciate everybody's, these are really heartfelt personal issues. We don't do this work because we are in a vacuum or we came from nowhere and had no experiences. So love all the suggestions that people had in the chat, and thank you for doing the questions. I just want to say thanks to everybody. As promised, we will let you know about the recording, that we will edit out all my goofy silent talking and some of the other stuff. Luckily, we have people for that, and our team's been really helpful. And we will have the slides and the handout, so all of those things you'll be notified about that. And just a reminder, I'm going to share my screen one last time. Sorry, I'm going to take your stuff away there, Ken. Your feedback's really important. I know you've seen the eval link, but we really, really read these things. I know you may think, oh, another survey, but it should take just a couple of minutes. And we really love to know if you want more of this topic, or you want Ken back, or those kinds of things. That's what this helps us discern. So it's really helpful to hear from you. If you haven't heard of our center before, or somehow you got this forwarded to you, you can sign up for our newsletter, go to our website. I put a lot of links in the chat, and I know hopefully that wasn't distracting, but there are a lot of things out there, sometimes too many things, but just want to make sure everyone knows about some resources. And to finish up, I just want to say thank you, Ken, for doing this and for bearing with us. And everybody, I hope you have a good rest of your day. And thank you for joining us today.
Thanks
Take care,
so much.
everybody. Thanks, Ken.